In this video, we'll be taking a look at the Adepta Sororitas, otherwise known as the Sisters of Battle, in the form of this Battle Sisters Squad box set from Games Workshop. First disclaimer, now I know this set was released about 3 years ago, but I haven't personally been that involved in Games Workshop's games or products for many years. I'm by choice a primarily historical gamer, although I do enjoy sci-fi miniatures. I just haven't really enjoyed or been enticed by any of their sort of game systems necessarily in previous years, but I've always enjoyed the fiction and the miniatures, and I've been intrigued in the recent years about some of the new releases, so I thought I'd get some of their kits, build them up, and see what I thought of them. And I was attracted to this one initially. I like the design aesthetic of it, and I remember the classic metal figures battling it out against fairly mono-posed one-piece metal Necrons in an issue of White Dwarf many years ago. So in terms of the actual box itself, obviously that's the front. It's gone through a couple of redesigns in the last couple of years, I think. This is an illustration of what can be made on the back of it. A few little directions there to where you can find out more information. A couple of little examples of different colour variation you can get for the different orders of Sisters of Battle that exist, and all in all a good little bit of inspiration for getting inside the box. In terms of the contents, so the box contains 3 sprues, many different parts. You'll notice straight away as I get these sprues out that there are pieces missing because I've already actually built the miniatures, but you can just get an example and an idea here of quite how many different bits and pieces you get within the kit, including all the different spare weapons. There are like bolters, storm bolters, melter guns and other special weapons that I haven't used, and different bits of specialist kit for the Sisters of Battle. And then you've got a couple of other sprues as well that take in parts for the Sister Superior, the sort of squad leader, and the different sort of weapons that come for her. You've got lots of spare heads and bits and pieces left over. So there's a lot of potential scope there for creating different combinations using these parts, or mixing them with other sets from within the same range for this faction. And the last sprue here, you can see there's a couple of heavy weapon options that I didn't use as well. The heavy bolter. If I were to get another squad of these, I probably would build that figure up because it's quite a nice pose. But those are the 3 sprues. And then in addition to that, you get a little transfer sheet, which is nice. And that transfer sheet, as you can see here, has got different transfers to take in the whole squad and the different orders within this faction that you can paint up with the appropriate decals then to go with them. And a few little additional motifs and distinctions you can apply to make your squad a little more distinct if you so choose. And it's quite a nice little transfer sheet, that. In addition to which, then there's the instruction manual, which is done in a fairly common format from other kits that I've seen and explored so far, in terms of laying out what the different symbology throughout the information leaflet means, in terms of building alternatives or using different parts or duplicates, lays out what the sprues are, what else is in the box, and in this case as well the different bases that you'll receive. Here there's a bit of information in a basic way of how you could set the squads up to fit in with the respective army list for the game system. And then as you go through, you can see it flows through each of the different poses for the figures, their different options, etc. So for example here, the squad leader, you can see, okay, you can go with this body pose, and then there's this weapon, or this weapon for that arm, this weapon for that arm, and then the various combinations that exist for that secondary weapon or sidearm or ranged weapon, and the different variants you put it in, and the different heads you can use. I mean, you could literally use any of the heads in the box. There's quite a large selection of helmeted, unhelmeted, unhelmeted that they've got hair, no hair, they've got bionic eyes, all sorts of bits and pieces there. And then it goes through all the other figures as well. This one here is representative of one of my, it's not a complaint, but minor awareness points for this set, and indeed the design philosophy of various Games Workshop kits in the present day. But you can see, okay, for example, this figure here is created using these parts from the main sprue, and that's where you'll end up. And then your choice is, do you want it to be posed like this, or do you want it to have this particular heavy weapon? In some cases throughout the kit, you can put the different special weapons on more than one figure In other cases, you cannot. This is an example of this one can take this heavy bolter, or it can take this, and that's basically it. Whereas if we flick through, you can see these figures, you have a more broad option of, okay, they can take a bolter or a special weapon, and they can take any of the special weapons because those weapons fit to the same arm set regardless. And I'll show this on some of the actual built figures. Same example going on here. And in this case, there are two figures that can only be equipped a certain way. That said, depending on your level of desire to do so and the tools you have available to yourself, there is scope to convert these figures to have different weapons, different poses, but obviously you'd need to be comfortable with that, have the materials with it, and if you're not sure, it is quite an expensive kit to be slicing up and trying to repose with the potential for mistakes. You don't want to damage or irreparably alter a figure in a way that you don't like necessarily. But in any case, we'll go on and have a little look at the figures. So here they are. These are the figures as I've constructed them from the box. You can build 10 Sisters of Battle using the contents of the box. You will notice it says there are 11 miniatures available. That's because you can build an additional little figure, which is shown on the box just here on a smaller base, but I haven't chosen to put that together because I just wanted to put the sort of main figures together for now. The first thing I'll say is I realise for those of you that are very familiar with the system as it exists that this hasn't been made up in any way to be optimised for the game system. I realise that I've built a couple of weapon combinations perhaps that aren't necessarily loud, etc. You'll just have to forgive me that because I wanted to build them for my enjoyment, roughly speaking, and try out different bits and pieces because that's what I wanted to do with them. I won't necessarily be using them for the system. I might just paint them up for my own enjoyment. So in terms of the figures as they come in the box, so the one at the front here in the most dramatic pose, that is the Sister Superior, who I've got brandishing this particular icon. She's got a bolter in her offhand and a holstered sword at one side, and then a holstered pistol on the other side. In terms of other things I've included in the squad, so we've got one figure here advancing with the heavy flamer. This is basically the only figure that can take this weapons system, which could lead to some duplication if you had more than one squad, at least as far as I can tell without some significant remodelling anyway of other poses. Special weapons wise, I gave this advancing figure one of the storm bolters because I quite like that pose. That's probably quite a hefty thing to be trying to fire on the move like that. And then this figure's been given a melter gun, and this is one of the few figures I've given no helmet to, just for a bit of variation. I realised that for realism, in inverted commas purposes, you don't armour somebody like a tank and then walk around with your head exposed so you can get that blown off. But for the purposes of a little bit of interest, and because it's kind of cool, for example, the Sister Superior's got the robed head, this one's only got the respirator on, and I have got one figure, there you go, who's actually got the front faceplate of her helmet up. But that, you can invent a narrative reason for that, perhaps as defective or something like that. In any case, so that's the other special weapon. That is the melter gun I've put into the squad. And those are the specialist weapons within the squad. The one thing I didn't put into the squad was the icon bearer, which you can see here. That pose is this figure here on the left-hand side. Now, the arms that I've actually given that figure are the alternative arms for the figure that has the heavy flamer, who is pointing and therefore grasping a bolter to one side. These arms fit relatively well. The only bit of conversion that was required was the removal of a slung bolter in a case on the belt line behind, and then there's a slight gap in the model which I've covered up by applying a holstered pistol, which gives me a fairly unique pose on that figure, and meant I didn't have to have this large icon being held in the squad as well. And that brings me on to my most minor of gripes about this set. The figures are very, very nice, wonderfully detailed. The sort of relative scale of them has obviously gone up in terms of height and dynamics, in keeping with Games Workshop's more modern style of sculpting. Everything's getting a little bit larger scale-wise over time. But it's the fact that the kits, whilst there are a lot of different bits and pieces in them, actually do have some design elements that curtail the level of customization you can get from the figures. For example, there are other kits where you get the legs, you get the torso, you get the arms. That enables you to relatively position the figures. There's still limitations in ways that give you a greater scope of variation for poses and potential conversions. The problem with these figures is that they are multi-part in one sense and not strictly monopose, very few parts clipped together, but they do limit the way you construct them. For example, that the back of the armor torso will be connected to one of the legs, and then the front of the armor torso will be connected to another part. To show you this in the instructions, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, in that this back part of the model and this front part of the model are separate and have to go together. And that's the case for multiple of the different poses. Here's another example. As such, because you don't have the option to articulate them at the waist and change their pose, as you can with other figures, both within Games Workshop's range and made by other manufacturers, you are actually limited in terms of the dynamic nature of the poses. And some of the figures in this box set, but not necessarily in all of their box sets, are then further limited by only having certain arm choices. Technically, this figure can only have these two combinations, and that's it, which is going to lead to some pretty rapid duplication, short of the fact that you can have a different head or helmet on each of the figures. So that is what I would say is the biggest limitation with this kit. I have seen it in some of their other kits as well, but not all of them. And it does mean that, for example, as you look at the figures, you are almost always going to be limited to, say, the Sister Superior. She's going to be in that pose every time. She's going to be in that dynamic pose, looking to the side, one arm back, one arm forward. And the only real variation you get to choose is the head and the relative weapons, what are in the hands, and maybe some other little bits and pieces of detail on the belt kit. Same example, but all these poses are going to come out the same way every time. And that would be fine in terms of the stance of the legs, as I say, if you had some way of altering the upper half of the body and therefore the pose and the nature of the dynamic. You can obviously have the heads pointing in different directions to give them a different sense of articulation. So, for example, to use this generic trooper, the nature of this pose, the weight, momentum, dynamism of it is changed by potentially just the way the head is pointing in this case. But nevertheless, it does mean that as you put the figures together, because of the overlap between, say, having a left leg to the front plate and a right leg to the back plate, and then even more parts than that fit together in a certain way, there is a limitation there that the stances are going to be relatively similar. And then some of them, for example, this is another good, can only really be armed a certain way. In this case, this figure, the main option it gives you is they can be pulling the pin of the grenade with their teeth, which is in reality not an advisable thing to do, or you can have the arm back throwing a grenade, and they're always going to be in that stance. Now this figure you could give them firing a weapon from the hip, as you can see in some of the other examples as well. But there is just that little sense of limitation because they've chosen to design the figures to fit together in this fashion, which is fine, and no doubt within the design process they've maybe identified that is the best way to incorporate all these nice bits of design and sculpting in such a fashion as to give them the sort of look and the pleasing aesthetic that they do have when they go together, as you can see from the figures I've constructed and from the images on the box. But it's just something to bear in mind, which is that if you're gonna, I suggest, buy lots of these, you're going to want to find ways to try and vary them as much as possible. And you can do that, like I say, with little touches in terms of perhaps trying to convert the arms, having the heads pointing a different way, even just painting the colours and details slightly differently. You can see a lot of things and do minor conversions by paint without even chopping a miniature up. But it's something worth considering when putting these figures together. And in other videos that I do of Games Workshop kits that exist at the moment, I will compare that to both newer and more recent designs and slightly older ones as well, because some kits have been out for a few years, and obviously the nature and way of planning the designs and then sculpting and creating and how these figures are going to fit together in the design process is changing and evolving over time. And there are upsides to it. These figures are definitely very nice. The fact that they're taller and larger gives them a greater sense of proportion, more chance for detail. They are excellent, very nice looking figures, and I'm sure they'll paint up great. However, there is a trade-off in the way that they've been designed, which I would suggest is a minor flaw and limitation in that there are always going to be these kind of poses, and some of them are limited by what they can take. And it's just worth considering that if you were to purchase these, or a kit that's been designed in a similar way. Other than that, that is everything in the box. I was very happy with them. They were very pleasing to put together. You will need sort of very fine skills with a bit of a hobby knife or a craft knife to, for example, get in between the buttons and rivets on certain things to get the flash and mold lines off. But otherwise, fairly intuitive to put together. The instructions were very, very helpful, very obvious. They're very clear and illustrative in what you want to achieve for putting the figures together, regardless of your level of hobbying and sort of model kit experience. And I look forward to potentially putting paint on them in the future. Otherwise, this has been a very quick look at the Sisters of Battle, the Adepta Sororitas Battle Sisters squad, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.